Bem-vindo.
Bienvenue.
Karibu.
Marhaba.
Welcome to Thriving Africa podcast, where we're all about trade and economy on the African continent.
We'll be discussing and analyzing intra-African trade, highlighting key projects, providing concrete tips, and experience sharing.
Hi, guys. Welcome to this first episode of the Africa Thriving podcast. We're going to get there. We are your hosts, Wincate and myself, Chiraz, and we're so excited about this first episode. It's going to be different with what's going to come next, but we really wanted to take the time to, considering our experience working at the Pan-African Chamber of Commerce, talking with the private sector, being a private sector, but also talking with the authorities, to give you a little bit of, from our opinion, our perspective, an overview of Africa's trade and economy, especially within the AFCFTA.
Oh, thank you, Chiraz. And again, it's a pleasure to be here with you and talking about Africa trade and economy and getting to have everybody jump on the same boat to see how do we actually achieve that vision. And when you mentioned the AFCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, is quite exciting. I think it's the buzz of the news when you talk about Africa trade and economy. And to say the least, it's been a 58-year journey since the foundation of the OAU in 1963, all the way to the official starting of the AFCFTA in 2021, January. So it will be interesting to see what is needed for us to have this integrated African market that everybody's talking about too, and having the context maybe from your end as a business person to see over the last 2 years, actually it's been 1 year when it's been actually officially operational, what your experience has been, your expectations, as well as to what is needed for us to actually actualize it.
Oh, for sure. And I think, we were just talking about how there is an AFCFTA Women and Youth Conference, and we're seeing all these conferences and all these articles. And I think there's a lot of question marks, not just from our end, but a lot of people that whether do not understand what the AFCFTA is or how it's going to work. We have done, so as I had mentioned last time, we've done a webinar where we were talking about actually trade in some of the region, and some even people from governments were wondering how it's going to work, especially with the regional economic community, so the RECs, right? So wondering how the AFCFTA will work with it, which one will have more of a sovereignty, who should they go to when it's going to go to trade. And I think even with that, I was wondering actually to know if, for example, the chambers of commerce or the private sector you worked with, did they have also this questioning? I feel sometimes even some people do not understand who are the RECs, what do they do, how do they work? So I think there's a little bit, this lack of information, maybe not for the sake of wanting to keep everything, but maybe forgetting because the priority today would be the implementation of the AFCFTA. So I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's about the dissemination of the information. Like there's a lot of things that are happening. There are so many moving parts for us to even achieve this. As you mentioned with the regional economic communities, this comes from the Abuja Treaty from 1991 when the Africa Economic Community was first founded. And essentially it was to find countries that have a similarity, that have similar harmonizations to start working together. So the AFCFTA essentially is not saying that we are undoing all this work that has been done since then, rather is to build on the current existing blocks, seeing which of them already are advanced when it comes to regional integration, and then what do we pick up from those policies to harmonize with other regions. So an example you could see is the discussions around COMESA as well as SADC and EAC already starting to harmonize like their trading, having like what they were calling like an e-gate so that you can be able to have trade information circulated within that region already happening. So it's how do we then connect, let's say, the eastern side of Africa to the western side of Africa and having similar policies and harmonization. And that's why we're saying there's a lot of work cut out for the AFCFTA Secretariat as well as the African Union to bring those matters of customs, tariffs, especially the certificates of origin into one body that then we say we are all trading under the same regulations and rules that makes it, a conducive environment for people to actually trade under.
For sure. So I kind of want to take one step back quickly, just for maybe some of our listeners, because we have, it's for you guys, this podcast. So the African Union recognized 8 regional economic communities. So just to tell you like what they are, or at least which they are, because if we tell you this and you might not know, or maybe you do know, and it's always good, it's a good refresher. So there is the Arab Maghreb Union, Yuma. I am from Algeria, and sometimes it is sad because unfortunately it's not really working. Sorry, not politically speaking now, we're just really talking economic wise. It might be really the least active of all the region, but it's okay. We have, like Wincate has mentioned, COMESA, so the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa. We have CENSAD, which is a little bit less known, but it's the Community of Sahel-Saharan States. We have EAC, she mentioned it too. Well, she's an Ethiopian from Kenya, so that makes sense. But I have to say that there are a couple of those that you might have heard more than others. For example, CENSAD, which is the Community of Sahel-Saharan States, we don't hear about it as much. Doesn't seem like they are as active, but they are as well. So EAC is the East African Community. We have also ECCAS, which is the Economic Community of Central African States. We have ECOWAS, so the Economic Community of West African States, which I do believe also people are a bit more knowledgeable about. We have IGAD, so the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, and we have SADC, so the Southern African Development Community. Obviously, we can put you, if you want, maybe more links about it, so that, or if you have questions, let us know. But I thought it was just good to, let's go back a little bit to tell people. So pretty much, we are 58 countries, it's organized by regions. And yes, like Wincate was saying, it's about building up on what already exists. It is, so to a certain extent, and we had somebody telling us that in some of our webinars as well, is how when you're going to be doing trade, if it is in your region, it is your Rex that's going to be the one actually facilitating all that and overviewing. As soon as you're getting out of your community, this is when the AFCFTA jumps in. So I think that's, like, to simplify it to a certain extent, it's not as easy, and I wish it was as easy. But we were talking how we know now the pilot countries, right? So there are 7 countries that have been selected that are going to be piloting and seeing. So we were talking about the implementation, right? So I think this is also what's going to be good. And I actually like it in the way, and I hope this is the attitude that the Secretariat has, and I'm excited to have them at some point so we can ask them, where we really go with experimentation, improvement, and always adapting. Because if it's how we think it is, whatever it comes to trade, I think experimentation is so important, and adapting. So kind of like seeing how having this pilot project as like seeing this is how we think things would work, but we see that those are the challenges. How can we adapt it so that we don't have it a little bit more? Do you want to jump on it as well, Wincate? Have something to say on that?
Yes, it's interesting. I recall back, I think it's when they were doing the verification around the ASFTA negotiations when they launched it in West Africa. And there's quite a bit of excitement that is coming in. And the main question again comes back to how much does the business community understand? Even first of all, now, do they even understand what is the standing between the different regional economic communities? Do they have a roadmap? How are they actually going to integrate and harmonize some of these policies? Now, we know right now the ASFTA, of course, has its own 2 phases of negotiations. You have the first phase that is dealing with the main products, which is the trading goods, the trading services, dispute settlement mechanisms, and the custom and trade facilitation. So it's to communicate, because right now already you have business people coming, for example, to us as PASI, asking that, hey, I know that ASFTA is working. I want to sell my goods from my country to this other country. And they're like, okay, the process is not necessarily as pick and place, because we have to give them again information, for example, how to export to a country in West Africa, let's say if it's a new market. How do they even understand that market as well, so that they can be able to position their products? And it's quite interesting to see how the different institutions are trying to put out different publications, meetings, and so. But the fear that we are having now is a bit of a duplication of effort, where we are stretching too thin and not necessarily having like a clear roadmap of engagement per stakeholder. Such that if you're hosting, like, let's say, business forums, how do you maybe break it down that it's one major business forum that is inviting people, let's say, to each of the regions, but you have a clear similar structure so that the outputs and the discussions are similar to harmonize. Otherwise, if I come with agenda XYZ and then Chiraz does her own with XYZ, we're still going to be crossing paths in how we are executing the same agreement or the same type of engagements that we want to see within the regions. Perhaps maybe on your end, what you think around that segment.
I actually loved it, and it just reminds me of what I do believe so much in, which is sharing of experience and sharing like what you do. I think whenever we do a work, and I had mentioned we do some work also with NEPAD, and one of the things that is always important, especially when you're talking about the regional or like even a business or whatever, is like, let's actually to start the conversation, this is our strategy. This is what we want to do. This is our challenges, our opportunities. Let's do a SWOT, guys. It's like an easy thing for those of you who do not, I doubt you don't know, but it's strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We can even just go with as a simple as a Canva as that. But I think it's so important if we want to have real meaningful conversation that we start by laying the grounds, being like, this is what we have done. This is our realities, but being okay, this is maybe beyond business, but let's be kind with each other, not judgmental. So whatever somebody is sharing is not to tell you, oh, we're better than you or we're worse than you, but more in the sense, this is us, this is how it works. And oh, this is us, this is what doesn't work. What can we learn from each other? And also when people are talking about the AFCFTA, so I love the fact that the private sector obviously want to take this opportunity, and it's so important, obviously, that hand in hand, you do have the governments that bring the vision, that really put the framework. But we had some conversation with some people that want to go a bit too fast in the way, like want to talk about, a single market or a single currency. And you're like, we're not there yet. There are like bricks that have to be built. You cannot go too fast. And also you have pillars of economy that you need to obviously implement, or even as a business, you actually have to think of a sales strategy. And yes, this is what I always like, let's go back to basics. And in addition to that, we need, as African, as authorities, as stakeholders, private, public sector, we need to go back to what do we have? What are the basics that we need? And the first thing that comes to my mind when I talk about when I think of the AFCFTA is today, as of when we're recording, September 2022, published this episode, it is still more expensive to export from Côte d'Ivoire or Cameroon to Ethiopia than it is to do it to Japan or Korea. You got like people. Can you see the map? I can tell you, I can promise you 1,000% that it's further. And we need to work on that, right? Because we need to make sure that we have the basics, we have the basic infrastructures, we have the logistical part covered, right? Because if we do not have that, we need all the elements to support us in facilitating that trade. One thing, when we talk about basic infrastructure, same thing. We are a very diverse continent. So we need to look at what is the forte of our country? What have we done? What infrastructure is actually working well? If you look at Northern Africa, for example, electrification, I look at Algeria, we're good on that. The country is fully electrified. We have access on the phone, the coverage through the whole country. Most of the roads are good. If you go to other countries, taking Namibia, and you have some other things that are very good. But if I take the same example, the roads aren't as, let's say, developed, but we have to also take into account that maybe paved roads are not the one that is adapted to the climate that you have in Namibia. Or also when you look at the phone coverage, some countries, some parts of the country, because they're remote or that the population is smaller, so it's more expensive. So how do we make sure that they have access to that? When we talk about amenities, like, access to water, access to energy, obviously. So countries have to look at what are they good at, what infrastructure is missing, so they can stick on their priorities and making sure that those basic infrastructures that they need are covered, so that after there are obviously all the elements to do trade. And what we're talking about logistics, we all heard of, and we've seen it, the Trans-Saharan route. We have also from Algiers to Lagos. So things are being done. I'm not saying I am not saying that nothing exists, and we're not saying this, but things do exist. Even recently, I think it was 2-3 months ago, you had the signature of the pipeline from Algeria through with Algeria and Nigeria. So we're working also on this access of energy together as African, which is great. But yes, let's go back to we want to trade together. Let's make sure that we have the infrastructures based there so that we can facilitate. I know I talk a lot about Algeria because I'm Algerian, so they've been quite some recent, but funny, not fun fact, let's say, they have opened recently, like maybe a week, was the 10th of August. So that's like in August, let's put it that way, because I'm like, at least around the 10th of August, they have been now, you have at least daily or every 2 days flights to a lot of Western Africa and some Eastern African countries, which we need. How can we decide to trade together if we do not have the roads, we don't have the planes going to? So we need to make sure in Ethiopia, Addis is definitely a hub. You have also we need those hub, also those logistical ones, so that we facilitate it. So yeah, that's a little bit, I don't know if you want to bounce a little bit more and discuss that.
Yeah, I like how you touched on what is needed, and infrastructure definitely is on the first thing. I think it's where I read like last year in 2021, where the ministers of the ministers under infrastructure actually met and started prioritizing on infrastructure, because at the end of the day, you have to move goods. And we cannot be saying you're going to take them by ship and then go around the sea and figure out how to get, in terms of port to port. So as you mentioned, and it was interesting to hear the highlights of the different projects. There are all these different projects that are trying to cut across the continent. Of course, there's the agreements that have to be done with the countries where those roads, for example, are passing. The interest in rail, because that again reduces the amount of traffic. So how do we use railway systems in order to move more of these goods between country to country? And another thing maybe I would allude to is, how do we start expanding on some of these technologies that are expanding in the logistics sector? For example, when we were in Rwanda, we had the Zipline. We had an opportunity to go meet with Zipline, who are using drones to do delivery. In that case, it was delivery of vaccines as well as blood to hospitals that are far-reaching. Now I just saw that they have now a partnership with Jumia, which is a big deal. So that means in terms of e-commerce, you don't have to wait for a truck or services to move them. It's just a drone delivery service that is actually quite accurate from the system that we saw. And Rwanda is quite ahead in terms of that. So it's looking at also what technologies are we already doing on a small scale that is trying to reach into further regions within the continent and scaling them up to do the commercialization aspect of it. And so when we build up on not only just on infrastructure, but it's looking at, okay, so as a continent, we can also agree that we don't have everything on the continent. And this is where partnerships become critical with other countries or other nations outside of Africa. I recall a conversation where we were having with a group of SME investors that came from Germany. And of course, when you say an SME from Germany and an SME in Africa, it's two totally different, context. But they specialize in cotton ginnery machines in this particular case. And so we were in Senegal, and they had been taken to one of the old cotton ginneries. Because again, when you look at cotton, quality cotton, most of it is coming from the continent, but the machinery to bring out what you're calling fine threads, textiles that can sell, especially to middle and upper market, is not necessarily as equally available. So there was this trying to do like a shared value exchange where we could do value addition within the continent, which I believe is another push that is being made by the AFCFTA. So these are just a couple of examples that I'm starting to see that could really be pushed forward. But as you said, we need to have a clear roadmap, a clear strategy on how we're engaging. Overall, Africa, what are we asking for? And then Africa, what are we offering? Not only as commodity, but also as value-added products that are coming in from the Made in Africa brand.
1,000%. And I want to add to what you were saying is that I think it's so critical for countries to understand two things. One, what is your competitive advantage? Think about that. Like it's a simple exercise that companies do automatically. It's obviously harder when you're a country because you're like, oh, I can do actually everything because you have the potential. But think of what do you want to prioritize? What is your competitive advantage? Actually, and it's good to then sell yourself in that way. The second thing that I really want to emphasize is how us as African countries, and I'm going to take an example on that, is and then talking about the partners. But one of the things is that we cannot do everything. We cannot produce everything. We cannot be self-sufficient as one country. I'm talking as one country, be self-sufficient on everything, because it's impossible. And no country in the world supply everything for their, like, when I say everything, I'm talking like literally everything. When you look at your house, look at everything comes, I can guarantee you, wherever you are, there isn't like one thing that is only for one, or like everything is from one country. And this is also globalization. That's what has pushed it, right? But we need to think of really how are we, and this is going to come into like a discussion later on, but like how do we integrate into our regional global regional value chain, and really seeing what is my competitive advantage? I can insert myself here. And then on the global value chain, how can we do it? And I want to take the example of the pharmaceutical sector, because this is something also that has been so much in our mind, because we want, as an African continent, to be independent, interdependent in Africa, sure, but independent of the external, so that when it comes to vaccines, we do not have to wait and be the last one potentially, because this is pretty much what happened with COVID, right? Africa was the last one to have access to it. But thankfully for us, we actually were the least, to a certain extent, also touched by COVID. So to a certain extent, it was okay, but it wasn't okay in that sense, because we should have access at the same time. Our population, us as Africans, should have access to whatever we need at the moment we need it, not when somebody, whomever it is, I'm not pointing fingers, somebody decided, but when we need it, we clear it. So when it comes to the farm, and that goes back to what we were saying earlier in our conversation, is there are a lot of initiatives that are done in Africa that we need to build on. And so I'm going to say, we're talking about the pharmaceutical. So when you look at the African Union, there are initiatives that have been launched, one of them being on the harmonization. So the African harmonization regulatory part, so that how do we harmonize the regulatory framework in Africa? How do we make it so that a product that is produced in Tanzania is recognized in Tunisia, and the like, and how can we export it, right? This is also what the AFCFTA will build on like those works. Every initiative is building on. There's an initiative that, and because of the AMA, right? So the regulatory part, this is how AMA, so the African Medicine Agency, has been built on, and you got the treaty, and now it's also into action, even though there's only the countries that ratified it. So African authorities and private sector, please lobby in your countries so that the AFCA get it. That you also have like a fund nowadays that is being launched, so that when you want to produce, especially API, you get also access to it. But when we talked about pharmaceutical, it was so funny to some extent for me, whenever we were talking with the private sector or the authorities, how all the countries wanted all to produce medicines. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but why not leverage? And you might have one that actually produce the API, the other one that does the production of some of it, and then some other that actually focus only on the packaging and the conditioning and then the distribution. You do not need to produce all the drugs. This doesn't work anywhere in the world. And if you look at some biotech products, you would see that sometimes some companies have one plant in the world for the world. So you don't need to produce everything. And I think this is the same thing when it comes to trade and economy. Whatever product, first, obviously, and I think we can all agree on that, and this is a change that we see, that we are not a commodity continent. That's it. We've done it. We're doing it. We're still going to have a part of it. But we need, as Wincate was saying, and as everyone agree on, we need to bring value to those products, because why, when we go anywhere else, we actually buy our product being transformed so much more expensive, when actually us as country, we can benefit from that. Our economies can benefit from this transformation. And you were talking about partners. There's like so many different kind of partners. We talked about infrastructure earlier, and that's also something that we need to understand, that not all the governments can do it, even if it is their responsibility for some project that they can do it alone. The private sector has its role to play, and to some extent, sometimes a third party from, let's say, outside of the continent has also a role to play, because they might have the experience, the knowledge, so that we can go faster. And it goes back to what we were saying, building on the existing, building what have been done and not duplicating, and learning from it to go faster. And that's a conversation that I want to push a bit now with you, Wincate, is really how we've been reading a lot of reports, and I'm sure we're not the only one, about the strategy of the EU when it comes to Africa, the sub-Saharan, sub-Saharan strategy of the US for Africa, and the China and the Turkish, and recently even the Korean. So obviously everyone is interested in Africa. African are interested in African. That's not like this is the number one. But I feel sometimes that we as African have problem as a continent, not a country, but as a continent, to tell what do we want. like meaning expressing it and sharing the information. We do know, but we might not saying it as clearly and saying, this is our strategy, this is what we want. It does exist. I've seen some documents. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist, but how can we make it so that whatever the discussion comes when it comes to the strategy, it really takes into account and really focuses on the priorities of the continent, and not having the continent, like, changing a little bit the storylines, like not the continent being like, oh yeah, this partner, the Germans, the Americans, whatever, want to do this. So yeah, let's do it, even if it's not fully aligned with our priorities. I think it's so important that we make sure that whatever the partner, and all partners are welcome, and this is how we work in everything in the world, we work together, right? But how can we make it so that, okay, you want to do this, sure, how can we do it, and how does it align to my priority as a continent and as a country? Like making sure that this goes line in line, and not just being, yes, like I was saying, not being reactive, but being proactive, being really the leader of the conversation. Because at the end of the day, we all have interest, and as African, our interest is the African countries and the African population. Like for the American, their priorities is Americans, and the Europeans, the European, which is common sense. But then, yes, how do we make sure that whatever comes in the continent really serves the population and for longer term?
Yeah, I like what you touched on, Chiraz, and I think this is where we now pull on to the private sector, starting to speak with one particular voice. And I'll even challenge this back to who we serve, the chambers of commerce and industry, because ideally they're supposed to be setting the tone of how do we see the markets, what do we need within the markets, how do they mobilize the private sector to demonstrate their need and also influence policy. This is where the public-private partnerships and dialogues are quite important. I think this is also an example of what you see when they were doing the negotiations around the AFCFTA. Initially, we had this discontent where a couple of, like you've seen a couple of countries where the private sector would indicate that they were not even involved in the negotiations. So how do they, like they're the ones who are supposed to enact, they're the ones who are going to do the trading. So if you don't have the person who's actually moving the goods and understanding the situation on the ground, how are they actually going to contribute towards an effective and a comprehensive agreement that also serves the country itself? And even expanding the idea of thinking that, and this one thing also I think that needs to be done in terms of mindset as well within the continent of the people, that we're not seeing just people coming in to do deals with Africa, but the people themselves understand what role do they have to play when it comes to these type of agreements and discussions. More so as well, removing the boundaries from our minds as well. Like if I'm Kenyan, not just saying, oh, I'm Kenyan and I focus on Kenyan matters. Now I should start thinking on the African continent. Yeah. If we have resources, let's say if it's diamonds or copper and the likes, how do we as a continent move manpower, move the goods, do technology, make it easier for people to now start trading, and then the dividends that are coming from all these different resources being properly actualized serves to the people within the continent with mutual partnerships that tend to see to that. So there's also that element as well of the mindset shift that needs to happen within the people themselves, so that they also call to their leaders that when you're representing us, this is what we are chiming for, this is what we need for us to be able to effectively trade, and not only become a statistic of saying, okay, Africa has only 90%, electricity penetration or this number of mobile. Like, you're not a statistic, these are the people, but the people don't think of themselves as the people. Yeah. They unfortunately just read the newspaper as a statistic and leave it to a small group of people to try and, push across, which to me, I think is quite a big duty for 1.2 billion people. You can't have just 1,000 people representing the African interest. You need at least 40% of the population to effectively speak towards the continent. So that would be 40 million people activated. So if I was to see an AFCFTA that is challenging the norms of how we do business in the continent and also with our partners, and even overall in terms of governance, we need 40 million people being activated. And this is where now media, the storytelling, the power of media, constantly talk about the AFCFTA. I'm sure now if you were to search, you'll find maybe it's only 1% of news that has been covering the AFCFTA. And that's why a lot of people come and ask us, Pasi, like, what is the AFCFTA? How do I do this? How do I get engaged? Private sector complaining about, okay, these policies do not even align with us. And one thing you can actually see, and I like the example of Nigeria, they're among the last ones to sign that agreement. They had to consult because the private sector is saying, you're not signing an agreement without us actually understanding what you're signing on to, what you're exposing the market to. Is it to our benefit or not? How do we do that? Then they turned out to be among the first countries that had an ASFTA strategy. They have on-ground engagements on the ASFTA, constant trainings on different elements of how to do, as simple as how to brand yourself. Because these businesses, of course, are going to be competing on the African, market. And subsequently, you've seen Kenya also developing its own ASFTA implementation strategy, Ghana doing the same thing, being the home of the ASFTA Secretariat. So mindset shift, I feel, is also something that's going to play a big role overall in how we start talking about changing the dynamics of doing trade and how we are represented and how we are as well vocal with regards to that. So Chiraz, I think that was quite a little bit of a tidbit in terms of how we start, even as we are discussing the podcast, to challenge how we think around them, and how then, as you're listening to the podcast, also sharing your voice, because from there, when you learn more and the more people start understanding what's happening, then we have a collective vision of how we actually engaging with each other without duplication of effort.
For sure. And I think there's two things that also I wanted to bounce back, that is what you were saying, is one, we all private, even just private sector, citizen, public authorities, we all have a role to play. Just like in the chain, what is the role that I can do? Maybe your role is just understanding and actually saying, this is what I would like to see, and just vocalizing it. That's it. As a private sector, it might be, oh, this is a project that I would like to do. Or maybe I want to partner with X country, or I want to export there. As the public is also putting the framework, setting up the strategy together with the different players. And the second thing is really how it is key. Well, yes, we need a vision. Yes, we need a leadership, but we need actually two strategies to always work together: a top bottom and a bottom up. So the top being like from top bottom is like the government telling you, this is what we want to do, this is how we're going to do it. But at the same time, having at the bottom up being like, you need the people who are on the ground, like Wincate was saying, they're like on the ground, but this is actually the challenges and the realities. And this is also what we think we need, because it's always easy to some extent both ways. When we are private sector and being like, oh, well, why didn't do this, this, and this? It will make my life easy. There's a lot of things that we're not aware of. But in the same way, as authorities, they're like, we want to do this, but there's a lot of things also they're not aware. So we need to make sure that we have the information, that we keep this conversation open and started and continued, actually, so that we make sure that whatever is being done serves everyone and benefit everyone. And as Wincate said, like, benefit at the end of the day the continent. And last but not least, there is competition, and competition is supposed to help us improve. And there is and I say it more as on a business side, because really there is space for everyone. There is space for everyone. So it's not because you have a company that does something or a country that focuses on that. That's fine. As long as we're making sure how to differentiate and how to make sure that we're serving a need, that is the most important thing. But we need also to get ready on that. And we need also, as African, to be ready to buy, not only sell, but buy African products. And yes, maybe at the beginning, because we talked about infrastructure, the prices might be a bit more expensive because we're building at the same time, the infrastructure is building everything that we need so that it goes better, but we don't have to wait for it to get started. So maybe, yes, the prices might be more expensive than from other countries, but we need to accept to pay that price so that we support our continent in its development and in increasing its trade and its commerce and its economy. Because the more we're going to do this, the more obviously access to markets, the cheaper the prices are going to get. And at the end of the day, this is also our role as consumers. It's not only selling, it's buying. This is how trade works. You have a buy,
Yeah.
like the buy and the
And you have
seller.
the buy and the seller.
You know what? So I just wanted to remind that, because sometimes we're always like also talking, I want to sell. You need also to buy, people. We need to buy, and that's like such an important, and we need to make sure that our product, our services are at the international standards, like that we are always seeking for excellence, seeking for the best. And even if we're not initially, but we have to continuously improve. So this is what we should seek on, so that at the end, people we are serving, again, when we're serving Africa, we're not just selling just like things just like that, and making sure that the made in Africa has this connotation with quality. With quality. That's pretty much it. Anything you want maybe to wrap up this episode, Wincate, you want to add on?
I believe we've touched on quite a lot of different scopes around the ASFTA, looking at it from the point of view of what is needed, with the baseline foundation being mainly infrastructure and accessibility, talking about policies and how that would look like, and overall the mindset, but most importantly, as well, understanding the dynamics of economies that you have to buy and sell, and how we need to generate that confidence within ourselves for our own products that we are producing, as well as the confidence for us to be able to buy that. And overall, looking at the kind of partnerships that we need for us to achieve that goal, because I believe that there is always those who foresee the vision of Africa, even looking at diaspora and the likes, and how do we coordinate all these efforts that we're doing within the continent and also with partnerships to have a clear, demarcated, like with veins, right? Yeah. With a vein, you have to know how it flows. So we need to put everything together, from all the capillaries into a vein, go into the heart to get this economy finally beating. If I can use that as the analogy of how we need to get towards the final goal. So that would be my message to us, and of course, seeing the role for us, especially as chambers, in terms of bringing together the private sector to have that unified voice that would then be able to speak to policies as the in-betweener, with the private sector and the public sector, to have the flow of information and engagement towards the ASCFTA.
No, I think I'm honestly looking forward, and I hope you people listening to us are also excited for all these interviews, because during this podcast, we're going to have these interviews and we're going to dig deeper on some of the aspects that we touched upon very briefly today. And also in a year time, when we will celebrate the 1 year of this podcast, we could go back to this episode and potentially also see this podcast is a little change also that could do, is like vocalizing the needs, talking about it, and see potentially how our perspective has changed, seeing the AFTA implemented and with the pilot, how things have gone, and like kind of a retrospective. Perfect. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for listening to this episode, and we cannot wait to see you for the next one, where we'll dive deeper on some of these aspects. Have a great day, I guess, wherever you are.
Bye.
Bye.
As always, pleasure, Chiraz. Bye.